Trails and Ghost Towns with Mike Roberts and Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. I'm Mike Roberts, and with me is Bill Barlee, a writer, a collector, a miner in his own right, ex-school teacher, and fan of how this country developed. We're talking today about the Klondike, about the Yukon, the big gold rush of what year?
Well, it's usually attributed to 1898, Mike. That was the high year of the rush. That was when most of the people in the northwestern part of North America, in fact, most of North America, heard about the Klondike. They were late, by the way.
Yeah? Well, we're the same people. I can hardly believe that the same people who found the gold in California of '49 came to the Caribou in '58 and then went on to the Klondike in '98.
Some of the younger people who were 20 years old in the California rush in 1849 and were 29 years old in the Caribou, and then 40 years later were 69 years old in the Klondike. Yes. But there were fewer and fewer numbers. So there were a lot of miners who came from California to the Caribou, and a few of those miners, 40 years later, actually went into the Klondike.
Who discovered? Who was the man who's attributed with discovering the Eldorado of the Klondike?
Well, there are supposedly two discoverers, but the one I think was entirely responsible was a guy called Robert Henderson. He was a Canadian from Nova Scotia. He was a wanderer. He was always looking for the rainbow. And he found it on a creek called Gold Bottom. But in doing so, he also met a guy called George Carmax and two Indians, Tagish Charlie and Skookum Jim, and he informed them that there was gold in the area. Then they went out and discovered a very narrow little creek, which they called Rabbit Creek, and it was foot for foot, the richest creek that we know of in the world. And this became, of course, Eldorado and Bonanza.
Yeah, you couldn't have a gold creek called Rabbit Creek. You had to change it to
sure.
Eldorado or Bonanza.
Sure.
We've got some gold here. We want you to weigh out a little gold for me, because this is what dragged them in, but the gold wasn't worth what it's worth today.
No, it was about $15 or $16 an ounce. So if at the end of the day or at the end of an hour you had, we'll say, half an ounce or a third of an ounce in this pan, then you would go to your gold scales, which were usually smaller than these. These are company gold scales. And you would take your tray, you take your weight, and you'd use troy weights, Mike.
Yeah.
And troy weight is different weight than a standard weight. And you'd check your scales to see they balanced. And you'd put your 1 ounce in there, and you'd see if your gold would balance to an ounce. And that's almost exactly 1 ounce of gold, which in those days would be worth about $15.50.
$15.50.
Now it's worth $550.
Now, there were unscrupulous people
Sure.
who shaved their weights on one side or loaded them up a little bit and did the miners out of their work.
Yes, but they were very careful in this. They used heavy weights so that the miner would be putting in 2 or 3% more than he thought he was. Now, they wouldn't go overboard in that. And I have a set of these weights, which I used once inadvertently and found out that I was using weights that were heavy weights. And this was by a mine owner, or at least a hotel owner in Gold Hill in the Yukon,
yeah.
which we'll see later on in the program. And he used these weights probably for about 30 years. And in doing so, he was able to take 2.5% every time he weighed up in his company gold scales.
How rich was it there?
Extremely rich. The creeks in the Yukon were, without doubt, foot for foot, the finest and richest gold creeks in the world.
All right, let's take a break, come back in just a second, and when we do come back, we're going to take a look at some remarkable photographs by some of the early photographers of that era, which in themselves are treasures, and we'll discover what it is to discover gold in the Klondike after this word. Welcome back on Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. We're visiting the Klondike Gold Rush today, and this is the treasure that people went to the Klondike for. These nuggets of gold, but they're not the only treasures that we're going to be talking about today. The photographs that we have to look at are treasures in themselves. Who shot these?
Well, most of the photographs we're looking at, Mike, were shot by Haig, who was probably the most well-known photographer in the Yukon, and Larsen Duclos. Now, the interesting thing is that these photographs 3/4 of them that we're seeing today have never been published before. They've never been seen before because they came out of my collection, and they were what we call the missing Haigs and the missing Larsen Duclosses.
And they stole from one another. I mean, claim jumping was popular amongst photographers.
Oh, sure it was. They bored left, right, and center.
Yeah. Okay, let's take a look at some of those photographs right now, starting, I guess, with this most famous of all. How many men went up that White Pass Trail, that Chilkoot Trail?
It's hard to tell. There were 2 passes into the Yukon from the United States side, from Skagway. One was the Chilkoot, which we're seeing here. That's a long string of individuals going up there incessantly, hour after hour, day after day, week after week. And the other one was White Pass. So we had the Chilkoot and the White Pass. 100,000 people, they think, got to the goldfields. So probably about 40 or 50,000 came over Chilkoot.
They all had to carry a ton, and this was a ton of goods.
That's right.
And it was checked.
That's correct, it was. And here we see the mounted police at the crest of the pass waiting to check. And there's the old Union Jack and the mounted police detachment up top, and they stayed through there through storm and through 30 below and 40 below weather, and the snow was piled, of course, above. They had to actually dig their way out of their cabins.
How many pounds could a guy carry? He had to go all the way up that pass with it on his back.
That's right.
How many trips would it take him to carry a ton of goods?
Well, if he elected to have it taken up by himself rather than packers, he would have to take about 40 or 50 trips up and down the Chilkoot, which they call the Golden Stairs.
And if he didn't have the ton, they told him to go back.
That's right. They had to pile it at the top, and that's why you see these piles of goods, and they'd be a name by them, and they'd say, okay, now you've got your ton, you can go on. But if he didn't have the ton, he couldn't go on.
Rough times in this era. Oh, it's not as wild as we perhaps think of the United States, but we have some very young murderers
That's
here.
right, and this is very unusual because the Indians generally in the Yukon were very, very fine people. This is one of the rare exceptions to the rule. And here you have some Indians who murdered 2 miners on the McClintock River, and I regret to say the mounted policeman on the right-hand side was working under my great-uncle, who was Inspector Darcy Strickland, and he was responsible for hanging these very young Indian prisoners because they had murdered the two miners on the McClintock, and this is at Fort Tagish.
Fort Tagish. And these photos here taken by Haig?
These photos were taken by Haig, and they're chained together, and you'll see the actual chains and the blacksmiths, anvils, and so on.
Yeah. These men worked hard. This is bench work, they call it.
Yes, this is where you'd be piling the rocks, getting down to the bedrock, or getting down close to the bedrock, where the majority of the gold was located.
So this was not placer mining the way it was in Caribou country.
Well, yes, it's very similar. This is 14 above on Eldorado, and Eldorado was one of the 2 great creeks in the Yukon.
Is that the temperature, 14 above, or what's that mean?
It's a good question. That means that this claim was 14 claims above the discovery claim. And this would be the original discovery claim staked by Carmack and the 2 Indians.
And this one shows you the kind of conditions these guys are working in.
This is underground, and this is permafrost, so they weren't worried about the ceiling coming down on them. They didn't have to timber it, and that was one of the advantages, about the only advantage in the Yukon. So they could go back and have a cavity or a tunnel 40, 50 feet wide and 20 or 30 feet in the walls, no problem at all.
Well, they didn't have much shoring material up there anyway. That's
no, they didn't.
Tough
That's
country.
true.
What's the child doing there? Is that a son of a...
Probably the mine owner's son, Mike, I would think.
Rough conditions, of course, and that one is of 13 below. That is just the opposite. This is heading down the creek somewhere.
That's right. This is 13 below, and that's 13 below the discovery claim. Still into very, very good ground, as you can see.
Is that a log house that the guy would live in right on his claim
Sure,
there?
he'd be right next to his diggings, and he only has to pack the gold from his diggings right to the log house. And surprisingly, they were very careless. They left it in jars and bottles and everything else, and very little was stolen in the early years. That's 96, 97, and 98.
All right. In our last program, we talked about Sandon and Bartlett's pack train, and we've got Bartlett's showing up here again. How many miles is it from the silver country of southern BC to Dawson?
Yeah, well, the peak came off silver, and Bartlett realized that the Bartlett brothers had to move somewhere, so they moved into the Yukon where the next great rush was. And here we have Bartlett's bringing out 1.5 tons or 1.75 tons of gold, and you can see the guards that actually are accompanying behind the team.
We're looking at circa what,
1898. This would almost certainly be 1898.
Now, the pack train with horses, I can understand, but This pack train, I don't understand. A 5-sheep team.
This makes two of us, Mike.
Is this a joke?
No, it isn't. These guys are serious. They came in by bicycle, and they came in by all sorts of modes of transportation. And so this guy felt that the sheep would be the best. They came in by reindeer. And,
At the risk of insulting an Englishman, some crazy Englishman perhaps thought that if he brought in the sheep, he could weave the wool into the clothes that he'd need here, and he was killing 10 birds with one stone.
Not only that, if things really got tough, he could actually eat the sheep, you see.
Maybe he wasn't so crazy at all. And the houses in behind on skids, they are...
Yeah. This is for rent. There's a little for rent sign on that, which is probably not visible, but that was, they were going to rent that out. And of course it wouldn't be good at all, because there's no, you know, it would be cold as the deuce. Almost the same as outside.
A 5-sheep team. Yeah. This is Gold Hill. This is the origin of the gold of the Klondike strike. Yeah,
this is what they call the White Channel, and the White Channel was discovered by a guy called Caribou Billy Dietering and his partner. And when everyone else was down in the draws working on Eldorado and Bonanza, he decided, he looked at this white gravel up above, and he thought, because he'd been in the Caribou years before, he thought, well, isn't that strange? I better check that. So he went up on the hog's back above and sank a shaft, and went down about 9 or 10 feet and came up barren. There was no gold there. But he still didn't trust it. He thought he was off the line. So he went over, he moved it over about 20 or 30 feet, sank another shaft, and hit spectacular gold. It was so spectacular, they didn't know what to do. But what they did do was they looked down on the draws below, and they saw all the miners working down there in both of the creeks, and they thought, well, we have to be very, very careful. We have to go down and record our claim, and then we'll come back and we record a whole bunch of claims for our friends.
You got to look cool.
They had to look cool, they had to look slow, and so they wouldn't attract any attention. That was the big thing.
Yeah.
So they thought they'd walk down the hill very, very slowly, dragging their feet, and this is what they thought they did. But they didn't. When they got down to the bottom, several hundred miners were already waiting for it, and they said, what did you guys find up there? And the secret was out.
You mean they were just so elevated they were touching on the high spots?
These guys were walking on air, sure.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So on that shot, we saw the top, and it drops off sort of on both sides. One side drops down to one part, I guess, Bonanza Creek, and the other down to Eldorado.
And Eldorado. But there was not just, there was Gold Hill, and there was French Hill, and Chicago, and all the rest. So this is just one of them.
And that's all the miners on top there, all staking their claims?
All their diggings, yeah.
All right, that's Gold Hill. Tons of gold.
Indeed. Now here shows, in 1898, September of 1898, 3 tons of gold ready to be shipped out via sternwheeler down the Yukon, down to San Francisco. 1.5 tons to the Bank of Commerce and 1.5 tons to the Bank of British North America.
3 tons. Did any of those sternwheelers ever go down with these loads on them? No?
Never.
Did any of those boxes ever fall off and nobody know about it?
No.
3 tons of gold. And how many shipments like that went out during the heyday of Dawson? And
That's very hard to tell, because a lot of it went out in private hands. Some of it, of course, went out by sternwheeler with the companies, but a lot of it went out in private hands. They would travel out themselves and go outside, as they said, and they would take 30 or 40 or 50 pounds with them. So we don't know the exact amount that came out of the Yukon.
Now, were there several sternwheelers on the Yukon at this stage?
There were literally dozens of sternwheelers. This is the Victoria, and this is 1899, either coming into Dawson or just leaving Dawson, and flying the company flag and the ensign.
The blue ensign. I mean, this is a naval patrol here by the looks of it.
Well, almost, but it was standard for
maybe it was a red
steamer. Yeah.
That's right. So these would be coming in with miners and supplies and out with gold.
That's right.
All the time.
Yep.
Up till freeze up, of course.
Up to freeze up, and then they were locked in for the winter.
This is what Dawson looked like early stages, and Mr. Haig, of course, made sure that to get his commercial in on his shot.
You bet he did. And this is Front Street in Dawson. This is early Dawson. This is 1898, when the town was wide open, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it was really quite an incredible town.
How close did the police follow these things? Was this as close as...
Started out as a very small detachment, and this is kind of an interesting shot because it shows a police detachment in Dawson, and this is just after 1900, probably about 1906. And the guy on the left-hand side, the corporal, is William George Simpson, and this is his watch fob and chain, and you can actually see his initials on it, and it says Dawson on it here. And on the other side, it has his initials, WJS.
Yeah, that's a government issue for corporals in the RCMP at that time?
Well, remember, this weighs about 1/4 pound, but at that time, the gold in this was only worth about $45. Now, the workmanship was something else. It was a jeweler out of Dawson, and so you have nuggets all the way along the chain itself, and the chain itself is 18 karat, so it's quite valuable today.
And this nugget at the very end has got a piece of quartz rock in it. Is that a jeweler's creation, or is this the way it was found?
No, this is the way it was found. This we'd think would be fairly close to source, but they haven't found the source of the gold in the Klondike.
They haven't?
They don't know precisely whether it was washed out or not, where it came from.
So that was Corporal Simpson.
Corporal Simpson.
All right. In addition, I mean, Mother England was still, I mean, as many Americans who must have come there, this was still very much a part of Mother England.
Well, yes, to some degrees, in that the law enforcement officers and all the other government officials were Canadian. And here's an example. This is about 25 men parading in 1900 with their small cannon, and this was at the time of the Boer War, so they were showing their patriotic colors at this particular time.
It must, because the color of gold must have been disappearing a little bit. I mean, guys wouldn't volunteer to fight anywhere if the gold was coming out of the creeks as fast as they wanted it to.
Well, they were very patriotic. This is probably Monopoly Square in Dawson City, so they probably weren't going to go anywhere, Mike, actually.
No, it was okay to volunteer.
That's right.
Wouldn't get shipped out quite yet.
Right.
And Victoria Day, one of the most popular celebrations.
Yeah, this is the Queen's birthday, the 24th of May, and they're waiting for a race to end. And there you see probably about 600 or 700 people, and there would be thousands of people downtown. Everyone came out on Victoria Day, and also the American holiday, the 4th of July.
Of course, because there'd be a lot of Americans there.
Probably
and
most of them.
When we take a look at celebrations, we've got a shot of it looks like quite a wing-ding. The couple on the right-hand side, lower right-hand side, are getting married, right?
Yes, they're the bride and groom, and he's one of the Eldorado kings. And the other individuals in the photograph are probably Eldorado kings, minor Eldorado kings, and the women are probably women of questionable reputation, almost certainly. And so we have a wedding feast there, and the food isn't as expensive as you think. A good meal was $1.50.
As a matter of fact, we have another little trinket, I guess, and this was a trinket too, a woman of questionable virtue.
That's correct. This is out of my collection. It's a 14-karat gold watch case with a diamond inset, and it was given by a saloon owner to a girl who was his mistress at that particular time.
This is very, well, a brassy lady, and this is brassy-looking gold.
Yes,
Gold's a different color.
Yeah, gold runs from silvery colored to a deep, deep copper.
Very nice, and a diamond in the middle.
And
this man was truly in love.
Yes, a rose-cut diamond, so it isn't as valuable as today's diamond, of course.
Where did you find that?
That came from her original possessions. I bought that some years ago.
What's her name?
I cannot tell you.
That's the story. There's a story and a half right there. Dawson, we've got some more shots of Dawson, because this town, as you said, went 24 hours a day, and we have the Bonanza and all sorts of other fine-looking establishments.
Mostly saloons, mostly gamblers were operating 24 hours a day, and some of the hands that they were playing were up to $150,000. Now that's incredible. $150,000 would change hands, which is the equivalent of about $3 million today. This is in one game. So we would have Silent Sam Bonifield and other high-stakes gamblers playing for virtually fortunes every time they sat down.
This was a shot at midnight.
This is a shot at midnight. This is the land of the midnight sun. So this is Dawson Street, Dawson virtually deserted. I think that's 4th Avenue. And there are still a few people wandering around even at midnight.
Yeah, a great shot.
Yeah, it is.
And do we know whether to ascribe this to Haig or one of the others?
I think this is actually Larson Duclos or Adams, one of the two.
Now, we've long looked at railways as part of development in southern Canada, but the White Pass and Yukon Railway was built when to handle this gold rush?
Well,
did it happen at the same time?
Yes, it did. Virtually late in the rush, and built a narrow gauge railway right into the goldfields itself. And you know, these are two of the trains ready to tackle the incline, and it was never a really money-making proposition. The idea was remarkable, but by the time they got there, the rush was kind of on the downhill slope.
Okay. And the last shot is, where is Dawson on the Yukon River? Is that the Yukon River?
This is the Yukon, and this is Dawson in 1898. You can see the tents. So this is an early shot of Dawson.
What's the population about that time?
Well, it varies. Some people say 30,000. Probably not quite that then, but very close to it, because this was the high point of the rush. and it was the largest city north of Vancouver, actually.
Yeah. We'll take a break there. Come back in just a second, and there are more wonderful collectibles to talk about as we continue our look at Dawson and the gold rush in the Klondike. Don't go away. Welcome back. The photographs we've been seeing are treasures in themselves. What is the significance of this little album right here?
That's one of the missing Haigs. There were 16 albums that went missing, and this is one of the albums that is, and most of the photographs in this album, as we mentioned before, have never been published. So this is extremely valuable archival source.
And we've been looking at these today.
Yep.
Just remarkable stuff. We also have, I always wonder how guys transported the gold that they found. You know, did they carry it in their pockets, or what did they do?
At first they were careless, put it in tins and jars and so on, but later on, as the gold became deeper and harder to get and there was more thievery in the gold fields, they went to this sort of thing, which is a kind of a strong box, a portable strong box.
And it is Skookum. I mean, they named him Skookum Charlie, but this is a solid piece of work. Look at the welds on that thing, and it would weigh about what kind of weight?
Well, it could probably carry about 60 or 70 pounds of concentrates, which would be gold nuggets, gold dust, and black sand.
And it would all just go into there, and the miner would have these buckets. Were they issued? Did he have to buy them?
He would have to make them. That was made by a blacksmith probably in the area.
And the more buckets you could afford to make, the happier you were.
Great, just great.
And it went into the poke once you got to the refined stage.
This is a very large poke. Now, ordinarily, this is a company poke, what we call a company poke. This would hold a little over 50 pounds troy of gold. Now, in 1898, Mike, that would be about $10,000. Today, that would be over $350,000.
$350,000.
Yes, if you were to fill this up today with over 50 pounds troy, which would be 600 ounces, so 600 times 550, so that'd be just about exactly $350,000.
And these were the company pokes. So what would they be stacked up in a little pyramid? Or
they would be stacked up and probably watched fairly closely. And when they went down to the Bank of Commerce or the Bank of British North America, they would be sealed, and the bank seal would be put on there, and they would be put in the company section in their vault. And eventually this gold would be weighed out and then shipped out by Sternwheeler.
Just like that picture we saw, those boxes with 3 tons of gold, each of those boxes would be filled with a poke filled.
Well, yes, probably they would be. Yeah, they would probably be pokes in there, or they would take them out of the pokes and just pour them right into the boxes themselves.
Yeah. And we've talked all this time, but have never mentioned Robert W. Service's name or recited any of his poems. But he was a historian of this time in poetry.
Yes, a little later. He came after about 1909.
Yeah.
But because of his poems, The Shooting of Dan McGrew and The Cremation of Sam McGee, we have some of the romance of the Yukon, which has lasted till this day.
I get the idea that when we talk about the biggest gold claim, that the Klondike was bigger than South Africa, bigger than California, that you had to have a gold claim, a gold mine, a gold find to find the richest thing, but that's not the case.
Well, actually, it wasn't bigger than either of those two you mentioned, but foot for foot it was.
Yeah.
But the actual production was not. But there were other places that were equally rich and even richer.
And they weren't necessarily gold.
No, they weren't. They were copper or silver or gold.
Next time we're going to be finding out what's happening in the Boundary Country. Phoenix is where we'll travel to next time on Gold Trails and Ghost Towns.